This isn't the last bite out of town, right?
It's alright, you're going ahead. I'm not gonna die on you, leave you in a cold, cruel, Carlosless world.
Okay.
Wait. I have to ask you something.
I know. You wanna ask me out? All the foxy ladies love my accent. It drives them crazy.
What? Keep dreaming.
I think it's safe to say that 2020 was a lousy year for everyone. But in terms of gaming releases, it was arguably a pretty decent affair with some great titles that launched that year. We had titles like the bone-bustingly difficult Crash Bandicoot 4,
Why do I hurt?
the stunning Ghost of Tsushima, and the mostly enjoyable Spider-Man Miles Morales micro-sequel, along with some top-tier remakes in the form of Bluepoint's remake of Demon Souls, and the long-awaited remake of Final Fantasy VII. Oh, and there was also Doom Eternal as well, the game that unfortunately didn't sell enough to pay its music composer Mick Gordon. Wait.
What the fuck?!
The year wasn't without its disappointments, however, and if you've been watching my videos recently, you could easily guess that for me, one of those games was The Last of Us Part 2. But there was also another game early in 2020 that was also a massive letdown. Funnily enough, just a few days before the Final Fantasy VII Remake launch, and that was the remake of Resident Evil 3, the follow-up to 2019's fantastic remake of Resident Evil 2. And it's not that it was a terrible game, and separated from its status as a remake, it's a fun, albeit incredibly short action game. But when you look at it as being a remake of arguably one of the best old-school survival horror games, Resident Evil 3 Remake winds up feeling quite shallow, rushed, and with an overwhelming sense of wasted potential, especially when compared to the original, which I think is the best place to start when talking about why this remake was so disappointing.
Okay.
The original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released back in 1999 for the PlayStation, and was developed alongside Resident Evil Code Veronica, with RE3 originally intended as a spin-off before it was decided to become a main numbered entry. Resident Evil 3 built on a lot of the foundations of the previous two games, while also sharing a lot of the same design philosophy, with it using 2D pre-rendered backgrounds that the 3D characters moved around in from fixed camera perspectives to instill tension, and a core gameplay loop revolving around managing extremely limited resources like health and ammunition, exploring and backtracking through a large environment to solve puzzles, and fighting off hordes of zombies and other mutated monsters created by the T-Virus. There is a number of notable differences that sets Resident Evil 3 apart from its precursors, with the most obvious being its greater focus on action, with a much higher enemy count than seen in Resident Evil 2, the introduction of an ammo crafting mechanic, as well as a somewhat finicky dodge mechanic for the player character, returning protagonist from Resident Evil 1, Jill Valentine.
How did a girl like you manage to survive?
Hey, I'm no ordinary civvy. I'm a member of STARS.
Another notable difference is the world of the game you explore, as compared to the first two games, which were set largely within one massive building. Resident Evil 3 sees you trekking your way across the ruined streets of Raccoon City, visiting a bunch of different locations, including a brief return to the Raccoon Police Department from the second game, as well as a clock tower that feels a little reminiscent of the Spencer Mansion. The main unique selling point, however, was of course the titular Nemesis, the terrifying tyrant that pursues Jill throughout the campaign of the game. The Nemesis expanded upon the Mr. X tyrant that was introduced in Resident Evil 2, this hulking menacing enemy that ambushed you a couple of times in the B scenarios, with Resident Evil 3 pushing that concept even further by making Nemesis a much more consistent threat over the course of the game, attacking you several times in various locations. Unlike Mr. X, who would just kind of walk slowly towards you, Nemesis was far more agile, being able to sprint after you and could actually follow you through doors. And much like Jill was capable of dodging attacks, Nemesis could do the same with certain weapons, particularly the grenade launcher. And if this didn't make him formidable enough, sometimes he would show up with his own goddamn rocket launcher.
It can use weapons?
But if you were playing on hard mode, which was just a poorly labelled normal difficulty, you were incentivized to fight him, as taking him down would yield you special items like weapon parts for stronger guns. Now, of course, all of the encounters with the Nemesis were scripted, and he couldn't just show up anywhere at any time. But the constant threat of when and where he could show up permutated throughout the entire campaign. This was also enhanced by the addition of a light item randomizer that would shift the location of powerful weapons each time you play, but also the order in which you visited locations across Raccoon City would change when Nemesis would spawn, which made subsequent playthroughs feel fresh and retaining that same sense of dread. Like, sometimes Nemesis will be waiting for you outside the power station, and sometimes he won't.
Okay, we've got to get out of here.
The game also built up a great sense of tension leading up to his arrival. As you make your way through some of the back streets fighting zombies, you stumble across one of Jill's work colleagues, who warns her of some kind of threat that is targeting STARS officers. And it's not until you get to the RPD, a good half an hour or so into the game, that Nemesis finally decides to make his introduction, where you're given the option to try and fight him or leg it into the station. Funnily enough, choosing to fight him in this case can actually save you a bit of time, as you can dash over to Brad's corpse and take his ID badge and then duck inside without fighting Nemesis, and you can then use his badge on the computer in the main hall. Whereas if you just chose to run, you would then have to venture over to the West Wing to find Jill's ID badge.
Surely a tall drink of water like yourself can put out a few flames.
Fuck you.
For a PlayStation 1 game, it's still quite impressive just how well they pulled off the concept of Nemesis, given both the hardware constraints and the particular gameplay style of the early Resident Evil games, with his appearance and abilities shifting across the game, and even when you briefly played as Carlos, he still attacked you. I will concede though that he does become a bit annoying after a while, especially once he gains access to his tentacles that he can use to grab you and throw you around, and fighting him can often feel a bit unfair given the random nature of how he moves and the fact that he never telegraphs any of his attacks. There is also a mandatory fight with him at the clock tower, which is a bit bullshit given the obtuse camera angles, and I always die here the most, even when I'm stocked up on freeze rounds, which I feel are the most effective grenades against him.
How kind of you.
So with all of this knowledge of what Capcom achieved 20 years ago, the prospect of remaking Resident Evil 3 was actually really exciting, as many games in the horror genre over the years have taken their own spin on the relentless pursuer concept, with one of the best examples being 2014's Alien Isolation, but also because of how good the Resident Evil 2 remake turned out to be. One of the biggest highlights for most people with Resident Evil 2 was how they redesigned Mr. X, taking him from what was a small handful of scripted encounters in the original into a constant, unkillable pursuer that turned up halfway through the campaign, just as you'd come to grips with navigating the layout of the police station, and then throwing a massive spanner into the works as he relentlessly stalked you throughout the building looking for you.
Why won't he just stay down?
The execution was fairly simple, but extremely effective, as you could hear his footsteps stomping through the walls, and his sudden appearance if he got the drop on you would often force you to double back on the route you were taking to your next objective, and make you more carefully consider your approach, as you'd never want him to show up if there were lickers in a corridor.
Hope I don't have to write a report on this.
The Resident Evil 3 remake definitely does expand upon some of the ideas introduced with the redesigned Mr. X, and much like in the original, Nemesis is a much more agile and formidable opponent in the remake, with a few new tricks up his sleeve, like being able to completely leap over you and land in front of a door you're planning on going through to try and put some distance between them, as well as a largely scripted ability to enhance other zombies with a parasitic head crab thing. To help combat against Nemesis' heightened mobility, just like the original, Jill now has a much more responsive dodge mechanic at her disposal, with perfectly timed dodges rewarding you with a brief window of slow motion to either land some critical shots in, or position yourself better in order to leg it away. This mechanic is cool and definitely incredibly useful, but in some ways, Jill's overall mobility feels like a bit of a step back from Resident Evil 6, given the increased focus on faster action, as Resident Evil 6 also allowed you to shoot and roll for cover even when you were laying on your back.
Good work. Nice.
With that said, this upgraded Nemesis is terrifying to encounter, and there are some neat spooky moments, like when you go into certain buildings, he will stand at the window looking at you, just waiting for you to feel brave enough to go back outside. So all of this is great, right? Nemesis is scary, and fighting him is incredibly tense, just like it was in the original game people loved and remember. So what's the issue then? Well, one of the biggest issues the remake of Resident Evil 3 suffers from is the way in which it is paced and structured, with large parts of the game feeling very rushed with no real build-up, as well as massive areas from the original game being controversially cut, with the clock tower being the one that ruffled the most people's feathers the wrong way. This becomes apparent from the very beginning of the game, as after a brief nightmare sequence with Jill, barely a few minutes into the game, Nemesis just unceremoniously shows up at Jill's apartment, which triggers a very on-rails set piece as Jill makes her escape. And while on a surface level, this is all exciting stuff, and it's kind of neat how the set piece ends by mirroring the opening of the original game, with Jill bursting out of the front of the building, it just highlights the incredibly rushed sense of pacing of this first half of the game. As in the original, it was a good half an hour before Nemesis turned up. And here, in this very linear opening city area, you meet Brad kind of like in the original, who then proceeds to die literally a minute later. You even meet the warehouse owner from the original here too, again in a fast-paced scene, before another set piece with Nemesis on the car park roof, before Carlos then rushes in and saves Jill. It all flies by so fast that you get the sense that the developers are trying to tick off a bunch of things on a checklist as fast as possible, given that you don't meet Carlos in the original until about an hour or so in the game. But here it's in the first 10 minutes, along with Mikhail, and setting up the fix the subway train fetch quest puzzle from the original.
Just a sec.
You then head out into the comparatively much smaller collection of Raccoon City streets to track down the items you need to reach and reset the power station, where it starts to feel a bit closer to that traditional Resident Evil feel, as you explore the few areas available to you and taking out a few of the straggling zombies roaming about. And that looming dread of when Nemesis is going to inevitably show up begins to weigh on you as you progress throughout this area. And then once he does, this is where the game is at its strongest, as you frantically dash your way back through the streets, trying to work out how to counter his attacks.
Carlos! That thing is still alive! It's after me!
This is also where much of the game's failed potential is seen, as this is the only area of the entire game where Nemesis is let loose in an unscripted manner and is free to pursue you in a similar way to Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. And this gameplay loop here is what I think most people were wanting and expecting going into this remake. There are some interesting ideas in this section that could have made for some really engaging and emergent gameplay if the city section was much larger. Like for instance, the one that stands out the most for me is the fact that unlike the original game, there are a lot of buildings that Nemesis won't follow you into, which gives you a nice feeling of reprieve, and most of the time Nemesis will attempt to ambush you when you're outside. This concept could have made for a really great cat and mouse gameplay loop in a much bigger and more open-ended city environment, where you try to plot out the route to your next objective, with staying indoors and trying to avoid being on the streets as much as possible being the safer but ultimately slower option, and the fast option of being outside being the more dangerous approach. They could have also taken a few cues from Alien Isolation's behavior tree system and have Nemesis learn various ambush points to keep the player on their toes. Or they could have had scripted ambushes in interior locations that are triggered once certain progress conditions are made.
Come on, you creepy-ass stalker! You want stars? I'll give you stars!
It really amplifies the sense of disappointment of this failed potential because outside of this one section of the game where Nemesis is let off his leash, all his other encounters are relegated to these incredibly scripted and kind of Uncharted-esque set pieces, which are kind of cool but also lack that grand spectacle of something like Uncharted. And the vast majority of these set pieces take place in the first half of the game, which highlights the bizarre structure and pacing issues this game has because the first half of the game feels, again, very Uncharted-like as you go from set piece to set piece, briefly broken up by what feels like an obligatory sewer level.
Oh god. I'm definitely burning these clothes.
All of these encounters happen the same way as well, in the same order, unlike the original where Nemesis could show up at different locations based on how you progressed. Then, once this half of the game ends, you take control of Carlos, who in the remake is the one who explores the police station, and the tone and pacing of the game completely shifts back towards something more akin to Resident Evil 2, as you explore both the police station and a large hospital in these much more open-ended environments. But the thing is that these sections are also quite tensionless, given how much more ammo Carlos is given, and because Nemesis never shows up when you play as Carlos, unlike in the original game.
Fucking hunters.
It's just such a stark contrast to the original, where Nemesis felt like a consistent threat, even though his appearances were very scripted. But here in the second half of the campaign, because of the drastic shift in pacing and the story structure, you almost completely forget about Nemesis, until he turns up for the obligatory boss fights he gets relegated to, with two of these fights being almost exactly the same.
Come on!
And then, before you know it, it's all over. Jill destroys his final form in an admittedly extremely badass scene where she gives Doomguy a run for his money by single-handedly wielding a giant ray gun. It's an incredibly short campaign, clocking in at about 4 hours on a first playthrough, and within the first couple of days after launch, there were speedruns up on YouTube of people beating this game in less than an hour. And again, compared to the original, it's disappointing because that game would take you anywhere from 8 to 10 hours on a first playthrough. And then there's the fact that the game has an incredibly low replay value, as it lacks all the dynamic randomizers of the original, but also just a total lack of any post-campaign content outside of the additional difficulty modes that just artificially inflate the difficulty. There's no Mercenaries Mode or any of the bonus challenge modes that the Resident Evil 2 remake added, like the Fourth Survivor. And in a move that feels like an insult to fans of the original, Jill's classic outfit from the original game is locked behind a paywall. And it's not even her original outfit anyway, as they changed it from a miniskirt to a pair of skirts. Thank God for mods.
Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me?
There was that Resident Evil Resistance multiplayer added on, which I think was meant to make the whole package feel bigger than it is, but I can count the amount of people that I know who played that on one hand, and last I checked it was dead as a doornail at this point. Kinda like that weird RE-verse game. I honestly still think that the only decent Resident Evil multiplayer we've had was Operation Raccoon City, which was a bit of an unpolished Left 4 Dead clone, but I think that particular style is one of the few multiplayer styles I can see working with Resident Evil, and I'm surprised Capcom hasn't taken another crack at it, especially given the popularity of horde shooters during the last generation, with games like World War Z, Back 4 Blood, and the Zombie Army games.
Okay.
As I said right at the start of this video, this is not a terrible game, and there's definitely some fun that can be had while you're playing it. It's just, if you've played the original, then you just can't shake the feeling of disappointment, as Resident Evil 3 really deserved a much better remake than this, and poor old Jill Valentine, who by the way is played wonderfully by Nicole Tompkins, she deserved a much better comeback to the franchise than this. Anyway, with that all said, I hope that you've maybe enjoyed my piece on the remake of Resident Evil 3 and why I found it disappointing, as I do know there are some people out there who genuinely love this remake, and that's totally fine if you do enjoy it. My next video is going to be covering the highly anticipated Resident Evil 4 remake. As for my video on the Dead Cells Castlevania DLC, I'll begin working on that as soon as I can bloody well finish the DLC, as roguelites are not really my forte, and I'm still in the process of getting good, as it were. So until next time, stay safe out there everyone, try not to leave us in a cruel Carlos-less world, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Okay.